Right. So good afternoon, everyone. I hope you had a great lunch. I'd like to open by thanking all of the wonderful people who, as Dr. Chakravarty put it, did immense amounts of labor for our edification. We are well edified. But it was a labor of love, no doubt, but labor nonetheless. So cheers. When I was invited to present at this symposium, I was, first of all, as a second-year PhD student, floored that anyone would want to invite me to speak, like on purpose. Once the imposter syndrome abated, then I was perplexed by the title. Genealogies has been used as a word by academics with such elasticity that it has, to paraphrase the Broadway adaptation of James Joyce's The Dead, become like a sofa which has had the stuffing beaten out of it. Broadly defined titles are, of course, extremely useful for attracting a breadth of perspectives, but they can be difficult to write to. The invitation had also come on the heels of a graduate seminar in lit theory, so honing in on a particular definition of genealogies was especially hard for me. As it happened, I was talking with a colleague, Thirumalar Drew Narayanan, also at UW-Madison, about our shared love of Conan the Barbarian and his bizarre relationship to each of our understandings of our own racial identity. In short, both of us as children reading pulp novels were bombarded with these images of people who looked like us, in Drew's case, Indian and Arabic, in mine, the other kind of Indian. These depictions were violent, villainous, scheming, devious, animalistic, and this is the part that you're probably not supposed to say out loud, we liked them. We found them comforting and empowering. And I left this out of my prepared notes, but what Drew calls apuism, or what I call tontoism, was the alternative. These impotent sidekick figures who, if they aren't very interesting, you don't want to be that. If the alternative is, this guy about to get killed here, at least he's tough. So all of this before we could articulate that these depictions were racist. But they were, on the one hand, the only powerful images of our own cultures that we could find in popular media. And on the other hand, they contained the appeal of the villain. I didn't look at images like this one and identify with Conan, the conquering hero. I identified with the back of that dude's head. So this is something that Black, Indigenous, and people of color have to do with the vast majority of media that we encounter, reading our own experience into material that wasn't made for us. I might have skipped a sentence. What Jose Esteban Munoz has dubbed disidentification. In this case, embracing a negative depiction and reinterpreting it as a positive. So as Drew and I talked about this, and then I continued to think on it, I realized that what Robert E. Howard and Edgar Rice Burroughs, H.P. Lovecraft, all of the prototypical weird novelists, what they had done was to construct a supplemental genealogy to scaffold the one which settler colonialism had erased, or attempted to erase. Fractured, at least. So this raised a few questions for me. First, why does a colonizer, steeped in what Patrick Wolfe describes as settler colonialism's logic of elimination, want to read or write material that preserves an essence, however misguided, of the target of that elimination? Second, perhaps more elusive, why do we as colonized people want to read it? I won't try very hard to answer the second question here, but I do want to spend some time on the first. Before I do that, though, I've been told that some of my recent land acknowledgments have been too aggressive, too radical. They might have made people uncomfortable, so I'm not going to do one. I would never want to make the establishment uncomfortable, at least not on accident. Besides, we don't need a land acknowledgement. We know it's stolen. Give it back. So I'm not going to do an extensive biographical reading, but I will say that Robert E. Howard was mythologized in his own time, perhaps not unfairly, as a rough and tumble Texan. And while he was described as by his peers as liberal for his time and place, his time was 1906 to 1936, and his place was a sundown county. As Daryl Schweitzer notes, his depictions of people of color were more likely to have been drawn from popular stereotypes than personal interaction. And Paul Chauvelin argues that editors such as L. Sprague de Camp were actively editing out racist material, again, racist by the standards of the 30s. So for the most part, monstrous othering was the encouraged generic convention for pulp authors like Howard, who reconstructed and perpetuated such staple fantasy tropes as all wizards are evil, they're coming for our white women, and my personal favorite, evil wizards are coming for our white women. These are all Frazetta images, by the way. Of course, these authors didn't invent these stereotypes. A trope rarely has a single author, and particularly with racist or appropriative tropes, it's usually precisely the lack of awareness or deliberation that perpetuates them. If bigotry were injurious to the bigot, it wouldn't exist. Instead, they absorb from the cultural substrate these conceptions and uncritically reproduce them. So I'm not here today to say that Howard was a racist or that he wasn't, but I would like to examine how his intellectual and cultural output helped to synthesize a racist superstructure. That wasn't funny to me when I put it on here, and as soon as I brought it up, it was hilarious. I'm sorry. So I'm particularly interested in how this is made manifest in one of his last stories, Beyond the Black River. It's now a novella, but it was serialized in Weird Tales in 1935, the year before his death by suicide. The story takes place late in Conan's career. The kingdom of Aquilonia has established a new province in Conajahara, the now annexed ancestral land of Hyboria's Picts. So on the one hand, I'm interested in this as a tale of settler colonialism with an indigenous population displaced by our hero. On the other hand, I'm interested in the story as a site of world building for Howard because it's the most explicit rumination that we get in any of the stories on the Pictish race as a race. To very briefly summarize, Conan and a young man named Balthus find a corpse slain by a Pictish wizard, Zogar Sag, who has summoned demons to kill some white men who imprisoned him. So Conan agrees to lead an expedition to defeat Zogar Sag, who is pictured here in the 1992 Conan the Adventurer animated series alongside Conan, shoving something in his face. So in broad strokes, Beyond the Black River is a fairly straightforward medievalist cowboys and Indians story, which is a phrase that on its face shouldn't make sense. But Howard's method of constructing a fantastical medieval past is to superimpose the cowboy Western mythology surrounding him in Texas onto a prehistoric pseudo-medieval landscape. Of course, he's not alone in this. It's very popular. It sells like hotcakes. The particular bit of mythologizing of interest here is in his depiction of the Picts, a race of stock villains that appear throughout the Conan stories. They're very loosely based on the historical Picts of what is now northern Scotland, which my colleague Miles graciously and surprisingly for me introduced us to yesterday. I need to preface this by saying we don't know a whole lot about the Picts, at least not from them. We know, importantly, that they didn't call themselves that. We don't know what they did. They were called Picts by the Greeks Pictus or picture, the Romans Picti from pingere to paint or pictus painted. And this is how we've come to think of them as the painted people, alluding to the belief that they tattooed or dyed their skin. There's supposed to be something there. There we go. So they're mentioned in accounts ranging from the, I said 3rd century here, I think it might be 2nd, I'm sorry, the Ptolemy world map shown here, to Julius Caesar, Isidore of Seville, the Venerable Bede, with a number of accounts from less famous or unnamed authors. I think the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a couple of saints' lives as well. We don't have surviving documents from them, but we have descriptions from the people surrounding them who are usually antagonistic toward them. So these accounts are questionably reliable as far as ethnography goes, but they are informative nonetheless. We also have archaeological evidence, which tells us something about their diet, religious practices, language, art, etc., but it's not a ton, and it was certainly much less in the 30s. What we do know that often seems to go unsaid in these discourses is that they weren't a single culture. The name was applied to a confederation of tribal cultures across several centuries who experienced an intensified cultural consolidation around the end of the 7th century through the 9th century. The term Pict seems to have been a pejorative for all non-Roman people, all of the non-Roman Britons, which we'll see in a minute when I bring up Julius Caesar. As far as the Conan stories are concerned, prior to the publication of The Problem of the Picts, edited by F.T. Wainwright in 1955, the literature discussing the Picts was basically bioessentialist. Race is genetic. Primitive people are dissimilar from civilized people in deterministic ways, with Picts falling into the primitive category. Just a second, I'm gonna get some water. And I suppose I'm far enough away, I can just leave that there. So Picts fell into the primitive category, making them theoretically interchangeable with any other primitive group. So Howard is constructing a genealogy of the savage, which allows him to swap out one group, which he's able to access through popular media, for another group about which very little is known. And just to show that he isn't the first person to do this, here's a 16th century illustration of a Pictish man by John White alongside an indigenous woman from Florida, same artist. So now we get to the painted skin. In Book 5 of the Gallic Wars, Julius Caesar writes, Omnes vero se Britanni vitro inficiunt. All Brittany, the usual translation has it, stain themselves with woad. A more direct translation would be that they infect themselves with glass. Possibly referring to scarification rather than tattooing. And indeed, Julius Caesar, in his own commentary on the Gallic Wars, later claimed that the Picts had, quote, designs carved into their faces by iron, end quote. Nevertheless, the idea of a painted people covered in tattoos stuck. So that's the Cliff Notes simplified to the point of reductivity introduction to the historical Picts. Before we talk about Howard's Picts, I'd like to share a brief clip of their appearance in the 2011 Conan the Barbarian starring Jason Momoa. Oh, that would have been so good. I promised my students I was going to rickroll you, and it didn't work. We're no strangers to love. Okay, gotcha. Okay, so here's the real clip. This is Conan as a child. He's participating in a foot race where any of the young boys among the Sumerians who can complete a race without breaking a bird's egg held in their mouth will be able to join the warriors. The boys are attacked by Picts, and they all run away except for Conan, who kills them all without breaking his egg and thereby becomes a man. Okay, so from there it becomes more of the same. But the Picts that we get here are these basically murderous Plains Indians who speak in weird animal noises, which is pretty par for the course for Conan. They're most often read as a Native American insert, and Beyond the Black River in particular lends itself very well to frontier readings. Howard uses conflicting racial imagery to describe them in the story. Every time we see them through the lens of the Aquilonians, the conquerors, they're described in colorist terms, dark-skinned hordes, they have black heads, that sort of thing. The first Pict that we encounter is described as eager to put a few white notches in his bow. The narrator, however, tells us... You're going to do that? No, I'm not trying to fast forward. Okay. So the narrator tells us the Picts were a white race, though swarthy, but the border men never spoke of them as such. The line is crudely sympathetic. The whiteness of the Picts serves as a humanizing intervention. Yes, they're dark. Yes, they're primitive, if you look at them through the eyes of the colonizer, but actually they're white. It's a terrible way to say they're just as good as white people, but again, the 30s. This isn't Howard's only sympathetic gesture either. Conan, as a Cimmerian who helped to overthrow the Aquilonians in his home, though he's now working for them, identifies with the Picts. He tells Balthus, "This colonization business is mad anyway. There's plenty of good land east of the Bessonian marches. If the Aquilonians would cut up some of the biggest states of their barons and plant wheat where now only deer are hunted, they wouldn't have to cross the border and take the land of the Picts away from them." Howard expressed a similar sympathy for the historical Picts. He wrote several stories about Bran Mac Morn, his fictionalized last king of the Picts, and even had one story where Cull the Conqueror travels across dimensions to go to early Britain and help the Picts drive away the Roman invaders. Howard was Irish American and became fascinated with the Picts during his own personal genealogical research. Thus, while he tells a classical Western with Indians rampaging across the border to steal and burn and murder the frontiersmen, he's also writing a personal history, scaffolding his own fractured genealogy with imagery of the American Indian. In this sense, his whitening of the barbarian might be seen as a point of self-insertion, appropriating the struggle of a colonized people to backfill the history of the colonizer, plugging the gaps in identity that are left for the descendants of Europeans once whiteness becomes a monolith. The story's climax is a classic last stand. Howard even uses the phrase directly. Zogar Sag has united Pictish tribes in numbers far greater than the Aquilonians are prepared to face. And while the two forces do battle, Conan, who is off warning the neighboring settlements that the fort will be lost and they need to leave, he encounters a swamp devil, which claims to be the half-brother of Zogar Sag, and says that each of them feels the wounds of the other. It then attacks Conan, and he beheads it, which ends the conflict after the Picts have destroyed the fort, but before they've spread to the neighboring settlements. The story concludes sometime after the battle, where Conan is talking to a forester who was there when Zogar Sag collapsed, though no weapon had touched him. Rather than explain, Conan says he lived by magic and somehow died by magic, before eulogizing the lost frontier, saying, "Barbarism is the natural state of mankind. Civilization is unnatural. It's a whim of circumstance, and barbarism must always ultimately triumph." In the spirit of time, I don't think I can think too deeply about this here, but my instinct is that Howard and I, a cowboy and an Indian, if you will, both saw in the image of the barbarian, as he's defined by the colonizer, a sympathetic character, such that Howard could fetishize the native, vilify the native, and still want to place himself in that role, and to locate within the struggle against whiteness a verisimilitude through which he could identify as a white man. How am I looking on time, by the way? Yeah. Because I skipped my skip points just in case, so we can move to the Q&A if that works. All right, in that case, thank you. It looks like we're getting a microphone ready.
So I know you know what I'm going to ask, but about, so I'm fascinated too by this connection between kind of the Western and how that, I mean, and of course it goes back, Twain does this as well. And if we go back, and I love that you mentioned the white drawings where he kind of imagines kind of the native as also like the Pict, and that connection is really strong. I wondered if you thought about at all how, because Howard also his Hyboria is sort of this even classical world, it's the proto, before this kind of mixing of different periods as part of what he's actually trying to kind of construct there. And I really am fascinated by this point about the barbarism, the kind of obsession with that and kind of colonizing and getting rid of the frontier, but then that the frontier is always present in this. And I just wondered if you could kind of if there was any connection between that weird ahistoricity that is pseudo-pre-classical, pseudo-medieval, pseudo-Western, and how those all kind of gel and generate together. It's really vague, sorry, but.
Yeah, but it's interesting because if you read, before he started writing the first stories, he wrote this entire history and chronology, etc. Did all of the world building on paper for like 9 months. And so Hyboria, which is supposedly this like land before time kind of thing, has its own antiquity and prehistory, but also seems to be like in an almost anthropological way, like describing the seeds of what will become society as we know it later. I'm not sure how directly that addresses. I do want to talk about, though, the way the frontier endures, no matter how much conquest happens here. He's obviously, his protagonist is a barbarian, and if he ever ceases to be that, then he's no longer our main character. So he has to do some work to preserve the barbarism, even when Conan becomes emperor and is just spending all of his time sitting on a throne. But there is this sort of idea that the savage or the primitive is what's natural and what's going to survive after all of the rest of this fails. And that keeps happening throughout his stories. Did that address your... Great.
So you don't know what I'm going to ask.
I do not. I'm excited.
Are you familiar with Leslie Fiedler's Come Back to the Raft Again, Huck Honey?
I am not.
Okay. So a short summation is that he looks at kind of male marriages in classic 19th century American literature that are sexually unconsummated, but that are stronger than the bond between, white man and white woman. So that there are these sort of white male outcasts who always have a dark male companion with whom they have an unconsummated but very... So could you go back to that slide that made you laugh?
But that's very Lone Ranger and Tonto while we're on the topic.
So I mean, I was just wondering...
The cartoon slide?
Yes. The hypermuscular, that one.
This one, okay.
Right. So is that sort of hypermuscular, BDSM-ish, kind of thing, only in the kind of cartoons that come out, or is it in the original fiction?
This is everywhere in Howard's work. So he was a boxer and a bodybuilder, and so a lot of his work are all of these like Texas oil field power fantasies. But I will say queer reading isn't exactly what I do, but it's almost impossible to miss in a lot of these works. There's anytime you have this sort of hyper machismo, there's a lot of homoerotic subtext where, like you said, not explicitly sexual, but not quite a bromance. And that, of course, happens here with Balthus. But so Conan kind of gets a new sidekick for every story because Howard doesn't want him to have this consistent. So Balthus dies in The Last Stand. Sorry for the spoiler. And then he briefly laments Balthus with a drink and then moves on to his next adventure. After they've been, really close for, I think it's like 200 pages or something.
Well, fun note, Leslie Fiedler had wanted to be a medievalist.
Oh.
There's I don't remember where the article was published, but some medievalists discovered that indeed Leslie Fiedler had wanted to be a medievalist. His first essay, most of the Shakespeare people know him for the book The Stranger in Shakespeare, but what I found when I was in his archive is that his first published essay was actually a Shakespeare essay and not an Americanist essay. But the famous line in the Come Back to the Raft Again, Huck Honey essay from 1948 is the problem of the Negro and the problem of the homosexual are one. So it's just interesting to me
line, yeah.
that, that this sort of racialized scene, came up today. So thank you.
Thank you.
thank you so much. Thank you so much for that talk. It's sparking a lot of questions. So I'll try not to do my usual 3 million questions basically about the project as a whole. But I do really, really appreciate the way in which your talk also, I think, pulls together some of the threads we've been hearing about over the past couple of days, but also some of the threads we've had about this morning. So I apologize if these are very, very broad, but I'd just be really, really interested to hear you maybe think aloud a bit about some of the threads that I see emerging. Two of the directions in which my thinking is going, sparked by this fascinating talk. First of all, the way in which questions around the contingency or the portability of whiteness, and I'm thinking about that a little bit from Tamara's talk this morning. And then I'm also thinking about, from Hassan's talk this morning, the way in which what racial profiling gives us is a kind of a fiction of a legible heuristic, right? And I'm thinking about the slippage between the Pict and the indigenous figure, the sort of the way in which that is taken up in the early modern period, but then also sort of reversed in some of the examples that you're giving us. I'm wondering if you could speculate either about or say more about some of the ways in which your work is thinking through, and particularly in this talk, you're thinking through the contingency or the portability of whiteness, and or the way in which what the kind of profiling certain groups, the kind of stereotypes about certain groups affords us is a heuristic, and that therein lies the danger, thinking about some of the takeaways from Hassan's talk.
Yeah, I'm not sure if this will be an answer, but so what originally attracted me to this is just the weirdness that Howard describes explicitly this group that he has always described implicitly as Native. He describes them as white. And I'm just wondering, there's on the one hand an uncomfortableness with whiteness for Howard, that he wants to see himself in this role as like the magical, and Zogar Sag is like summoning leopards and commanding them and doing all of this, magical Indian stuff. And it's unthinkable to me that Howard wasn't like, yeah, he's the coolest guy in this story. I don't think that's just how I related to it as a Native kid. I think the guy with the magic is the cool one. But so on the one hand, a discomfort with whiteness, and also the need to impose it on these people where he wants to see himself. And I think off the cuff, there's an insecurity baked into whiteness. They know it's a fiction. It's so patently self-contradictory that if you think about it too long, it just starts to collapse. So there's a sense in which maybe it has to be reinforced here by appropriating, when you're no longer English and Irish and French, et cetera, and you're just white, and that's what you're going to identify as. The cultural dissimilarity between all of the people who are white is striking, as striking as any other phenotypic difference. So I think, there's a way in which it knows it won't endure on any epistemological basis, so it has to endure through the imposition of power. And I think reading Howard very generously and optimistically here, that power is contingent, if temporally limited. I think for him in a way that's almost like ecologically inevitable.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for this. It puts me in mind of, what some of the anxieties and the romanticization of the frontier in the 1930s, in the 40s, where some people are just kind of digesting Frederick Jackson Turner's frontier thesis and this threat that the frontier between civilization and barbarism or savagery is the place where the American character is built, and it seems dependent on racialized violence that's inherent to the frontier. And I'm wondering what place that frontier, I don't know this guy's work. I just Conan the Barbarian say that to me, I think of, the movies in the 80s or something. But was it enacting or perpetuating this? We need the frontier. We need that struggle in order partly to shore up and identify whiteness as a continued position of privilege. And it's implicit in Turner that the disappearance of this place to exercise these differences may lead to decadence or whatever else he feared. So do you think that has seeped in a way to Howard, or no?
Definitely. That's probably better than I would have articulated it myself. But so Howard, among all of these tropes, like the evil wizards are coming for our white women, are things like, cities are always decadent to the point of their own decay, and things like all of the stuff that permeates sword and sorcery, that are sort of commentaries on the degeneracy of wealth and comfort and things like that. And to be a real, complete, decent person, you have to be out in the wilderness, struggling to become yourself at all times. There was something I was going to respond to right at the beginning of what you said that's slipping my mind now. So I only briefly alluded to his using the mythology of the Western, because I'm not really talking about Westerns as a genre here, but there is something in the way the American identity is built in the West that's like, most of the cowboys were Black or Latinx, and in all of the movies, of course, they're not. And over lunch, we had our conversation about the Sicilian natives. So there's a similar sort of plundering of identity. It's like, we don't want you on this land, and we don't want you anywhere near us. If you can be white enough, then you're fine. You can join the rest of us. Seems to usually be the call. But for the most part, it's like, no, we want you on our butter packet, and we want to call ourselves the Braves or whatever it is, and we just don't want to see you around while we do it. Which I guess that's the less generous reading of Howard as well.
Hi, thanks for that. That's a lot. So much to think about. I'm still I had to write down my question where normally I'm good at not doing that. So my question has to do with the process of slipping, I suppose, how the ice is formed, if it were, between the Picts and the native group, fill in the blank native group that's trying to be represented here. And I mean, it's remarkable enough that an Irish American would identify with a Pict, right? That there's a history to that's like does not make sense outside of America.
Right.
But to me, sort of the narrative you began to build at the beginning of your talk was sort of a absence of history and then sort of hidden underneath it, a delegitimizing of a philosophy of history, right? The Northern Scots, and of course, a lot of Northern British Isles folks, the oral tradition is incredibly strong, and at some point, oral tradition is no longer allowed to tell real histories, right? Whether that's an Enlightenment invention or you want to put that earlier, at some point that becomes sort of not the way you're supposed to tell history. Show me the manuscript, that's history. And we see a very similar thing in the New World, of course, of sort of what is proper, and then sort of real native history starts being told when it can be written down, and when it almost starts at a certain moment. It's that I was wondering if you could talk a bit about the ways in which not just representations of wild people in the woods, etc., but sort of the ways in which there's a sort of historical a philosophy of history that is shared between oral societies that begins to sort of, in the medieval period, get I don't want to say attacked, but sort of it becomes a problematic, right, in the Middle Ages. And if that might be a place to think about a moment of slippage of oral to text, and that becomes another way of thinking through things. Anyway, I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Gosh, I could probably talk for a whole hour and still not come to a clean conclusion, but I do think the late Russell Means. He did a talk. Well, he published an article that he had somebody else write down about the legitimacy of writing, or rather the illegitimacy of writing. That was excellent. I think it was published in Mother Jones, if I'm remembering correctly. It's also the one where he talks about why he wants to identify as an Indian, not a Native American, and it's really great stuff. But there is, so ordinarily I don't work officially on pulp literature, except that I love to read it, and so eventually it filters in. And I've been told repeatedly that I do a lot of work on race, but I don't think of myself as someone who does a lot of work on race. Rather, I think of myself as an Indigenous person who, in the course of living as an academic, has to talk about race at some point. So normally what I've worked on up to this point is comparing Indigenous text technologies to those of Western Europe in the Middle Ages, and trying to think around this idea that what is written down, and specifically what is written down in discrete symbols that represent discrete sounds, is the only way you can legitimately record information, which is, of course, patently absurd, but we still kind of run with it in a lot of ways. And it does reinforce this idea that certain cultures, well, I mean, just the term the Dark Ages, right, comes out of the fact that it's intellectually dark. We don't have a lot of textual records, so we just kind of assume that it's this depopulated wilderness area. Then the people have abandoned the scientific glory of classical antiquity, and it doesn't hold up to close examination. But then there's like this discovery and proliferation of writing that was already happening, of course, in China and elsewhere. But it does become a way that Western society, Western civilization, whatever that means, gets to say, oh, well, we can record this and put it away somewhere and look at it wherever we want. We can take it out of our individual memory and out of the shared memory and just put it over there, and that makes it more legitimate. And of course, there are ways of encoding and inscribing information in the Americas and elsewhere that get overlooked, just like the fact that there are massive metropolitan networks in the Americas that nobody talks about, comparable to those anywhere else in the world. But when 98% of the population dies before the colonizers even meet them because of disease, they just see the depopulated wilderness that they want to. I don't really know how that relates to the Roman frontier in the British Isles. My understanding there is fairly limited. It is weird that Howard is exploring his Irish history and sort of projects the Scottish thing onto it. But yeah, again, there are all of these attempts. Even calling them the Picts seems to be a sort of delegitimizing maneuver on the part of the Romans, which, of course, interestingly, because now we're talking about essentially pictures as legitimate language. I don't know if that, okay. There was a lot there. I'm going to have to do a lot more thinking about it. Thank you.
Hi, Jack. Great paper. It has me thinking about the long critical lineage from, Crusader romance to the, frontier Western, right? We can connect those dots through Twain and others as well. I'm really interested, by your invocation of Jose Munoz and disidentification, right? Seems to me, this image is simultaneously very queer, right? Yeah. A form of kind of disidentification with dominant scripts, whether it's like sometimes it's homosocial queer, sometimes you're kind of imagining yourself into a role that is not yours, right? A kind of like embracing but a kind of critical distance, right? And it's constantly happening. And I love the way you began with this idea of a kind of critical form of counter reading, that you're reading yourself into a narrative or a script that's not designed for you, right? So my question is thinking about this in another way, like how, is there to invoke Munoz, he's very utopian, this is about reading for a liberatory end, right? Is there anything utopian about Howard's work? Like, is there a possibility of resisting this idea of, a consolidation of white identity? Is there some utopian transformational potential in these works? I haven't read them, but I'm just interested in kind of what your thoughts are along those lines. Thanks.
Aside from, this sort of triumphant barbarism will always endure, I don't think on Howard's part, I haven't read into it that level of sort of ethnic nuance. As far as our ability to do those sorts of readings of it, I'm sure, which I don't think that I have done in the way Munoz would have suggested, more just, if the mainstream media isn't for you and you don't engage with the stuff that is written to marginalize you, you're not going to be reading anything. So I had to find the stuff that was appealing, and then rather than see myself as Tonto, I'm happy to see myself as Zogar Sag to a degree. And then there comes a point where enough people in high school or whatever have compared you to these figures that you're like, okay, wait, that's actually damaging. And I don't know how much of that, we become enculturated by the same media that enculturates white people to think about us in marginalizing ways. So, everybody that I grew up with on the reservation loved Pocahontas until they were like 14 and were then like, oh, wait, this is messed up. Same with Peter Pan with its like, that's why the Red Man's Red song with all these little like caricatures bouncing around. I remember my best friend at one point was like, when's the last time you watched Peter Pan? And I'm like, I don't know, when I was a kid. He's like, you're never going to let your kids watch it. And I'm like, it's a Disney cartoon. So he made me watch it again, and I was horrified. But that, it's at such a formative age, and that's where I'm seeing people like me on the screen. So I'm sure it informs my own identity. And I'm suspicious of the idea that the act of reading can be liberatory in a really grand way. I think there's material work that has to be done, and we're not going to do that just by reading things differently. But of course, the reading is a factor. When we talk about, for example, decolonization isn't a method of reading if you keep the colony, right? You have to actually change the government, not be a colony anymore, and then we're doing decolonization. But this idea that we can do decolonial readings and that's going to affect this dramatic change, I'm suspicious of that kind of utopian thinking. But I do think there's value, both personal and in the way that we build our communities. There's value in doing those sorts of readings and having those conversations. I'm not sure how fruitful Conan would be as a source of that reading. As I said at the beginning, I'm not prepared to say why I enjoy it as much as I was prepared to say why it's weird that he wrote it that way. I think, does that answer your question? Okay. I'm sure we'll talk about it a lot in the future too.
Thank you all so much for your questions, and let's thank Jack Wiegand again for his wonderful talk.
Thank you.